Welcome to Morbid Masterpieces, the channel that pulls back the curtain on the world's most disturbing cases, where the line between creative genius and monstrous depravity is not just blurred, but completely erased. We admire art for its ability to capture a moment, to make something beautiful and eternal. But what happens when the artist's obsession with permanence goes too far? What if the statue you're admiring isn't made of marble, but of man? Today, we are delving into a case that will forever change the way you look at a sculpture. We will tell the story of a celebrated female sculptor, a visionary artist praised for her unerringly lifelike creations, and the two detectives who uncovered her horrifying secret. Her statues were not carved from stone, but were her victims, preserved forever in a gallery of the dead. It is a tale of twisted aesthetics, cold-blooded murder, and a descent into the darkest abyss of the human psyche. Before we chisel away at the pristine facade of this horrifying case, if you have a fascination for the macabre and the mysteries that lie in the shadows, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the chilling exhibitions we have in store. Now, join us as we step into the studio of a killer and witness the unveiling of a nightmare. The city of Argento was a city of stone and secrets. Its older districts were a labyrinth of cobblestone streets and Gothic architecture, where gargoyles stared down from the eaves of forgotten churches. It was a city that had always had a deep, almost reverential relationship with the art of sculpture. Statues populated its parks and squares, silent stone sentinels that had watched centuries of life and death unfold. It was the perfect stage for the arrival of Serafina Monet. Serafina was not just a sculptor. She was a phenomenon. In a few short years, she had risen from obscurity to become the darling of the international art world. Her work was unlike anything seen before. She specialized in hyper-realistic, life-sized human figures carved from a unique, milky white composite material that mimicked the finest Carrara marble, but held the light in a way that seemed almost ethereal. But it wasn't the material that captivated the critics and the collectors. It was the emotion. Her statues, collectively known as the Ephemera Collection, captured human beings in moments of profound, raw, and often uncomfortable vulnerability. There was the Forsaken, a man on his knees, his face a mask of silent, pleading despair. There was the Last Hope, a young woman reaching for something unseen, her expression a heartbreaking mixture of hope and terror. They were technically brilliant, but more than that, they were unsettlingly alive. To look at them was to feel like a voyeur, intruding on a moment of pure, undiluted human suffering. The disappearances began subtly, almost unnoticed in the vast, churning anonymity of the city. The first was a young street musician, a violinist named Leo Vance, a familiar face in the city's tourist-heavy plazas. He was a transient, a young man with no family to speak of. One day, he was there, his melancholic tunes echoing through the square. The next, he was gone. The police opened a missing persons file, but with no leads and no one to push for answers, the file quickly gathered dust. A few months later, a second person vanished. This time it was a young woman named Clara Bellwether, a struggling poet who made a living handing out flyers for nightclubs. Like Leo, she lived on the fringes of society, a face that many had seen but no one truly knew. Her disappearance, like his, caused a brief ripple in the city's consciousness before fading away. The case of the Argento vanishings, as the tabloids were beginning to call them, landed on the desk of Detective Frank Miller. Miller was a man carved from the same granite as the city's old buildings. He was a veteran of 20 years on the force, a homicide detective whose cynicism was a shield he wore to protect himself from the horrors he witnessed daily. He was a man of facts, of evidence, of the tangible. He had little time for the abstract. His new partner was Detective Isabella "Izzy" Rossi. She was a stark contrast to Miller's weary pragmatism. Young, sharp, and with a degree in psychology, Rossi saw crime scenes not just as a collection of evidence, but as a story, a psychological landscape left behind by the perpetrator. Where Miller saw the what, Rossi was obsessed with the why. The investigation was a frustrating series of dead ends. Leo and Clara had no connection to each other, save for their transient lifestyles and a shared geography of the city's artistic, bohemian districts. They had simply ceased to exist. There were no signs of struggle, no ransom notes, no bodies. They had been erased. It's like they were ghosts to begin with, Miller grumbled one rainy afternoon, staring at the two victims' faces on the corkboard. No one saw anything, no one knows anything. It's like the ground just opened up and swallowed them. Or someone collected them, Rossi mused, her gaze distant. Someone who moves through their world. Someone who saw them not as people but as objects. The first thread, the one that would begin to unravel the entire horrifying tapestry, came from an unexpected source. Rossi, off-duty, was a lover of the arts. She found solace in the quiet halls of museums and galleries. On a particularly frustrating day, she decided to visit the much-hyped Serafina Monet exhibit at the prestigious Argento Grand Gallery. She walked through the exhibit hall, the air cool and silent. The statues were arranged on simple black plinths, each one illuminated by a single dramatic spotlight. The effect was breathtaking and deeply chilling. The figures were so real, so full of a silent, screaming emotion, that Rossi felt an involuntary shudder. It was like walking through a wing of a hospital for the terminally anguished. She stopped in front of a piece titled The Fallen Sparrow. It depicted a young man on the ground, his body twisted as if he had just fallen. One hand clutched a shattered violin, the other was outstretched, his fingers curled in a silent plea. His face was a masterpiece of sculpted despair, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as if in a gasp of shock. The realism was uncanny. Rossi could see the faint tracery of veins on his outstretched hand, the texture of his worn leather jacket, the fraying of his shoelaces. And then she saw it. On the back of the statue's outstretched hand, just below the knuckle of the ring finger, was a small, exquisitely detailed imperfection in the stone. It was a tiny tattoo of a sparrow with a broken wing. The air left Rossi's lungs in a rush. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she pulled up the missing persons file for Leo Vance. She zoomed in on the photo of his right hand, a detail noted in the report. There it was, the exact same tattoo, a sparrow with a broken wing. She felt a wave of nausea. Her mind reeled, trying to process the impossible, monstrous implication. She stumbled back, her eyes darting from one statue to the next. She looked at The Last Hope, the statue of the desperate young woman. In the file for Clara Bellwether, it had been noted that she had a small, crescent moon-shaped scar on her left temple, the result of a childhood accident. Rossi moved closer to the statue, her heart pounding in her chest. There, barely visible in the soft gallery light, was the same delicate, crescent-shaped scar, a subtle, perfect detail on a flawless, stone-like face. "Frank," she whispered into her phone, her voice trembling. "You need to get down to the Grand Gallery. Now, I think I've found our missing persons." Miller arrived, his face a mask of skepticism as Rossi explained her terrifying theory. He was a man who trusted fingerprints and DNA, not the artistic intuitions of his partner. "Izzy, for God's sake," he said, keeping his voice low. "They're statues. Made of whatever the hell this stuff is. The artist is a perfectionist. She probably saw these people on the street, was inspired by them, and hired models to pose for her. She recreated the details. That's what artists do." "No, Frank, you don't understand," she insisted, her eyes wide with a frantic certainty. "Look at them. It's not just the details. It's the emotion. It's real. This isn't a model posing in a moment of sadness. This is a snapshot of genuine terror. This is the moment it happened to them." Miller, despite his disbelief, could not deny the deeply unsettling aura of the collection. He walked through the gallery, his detective's eyes scanning the figures. The realism was beyond anything he had ever seen. He could almost feel the cold emanating from the figures, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Okay, let's just say you're right," he said, the words feeling absurd on his tongue. "What are you suggesting? That a world-famous artist is kidnapping people and—" "What? turning them into stone? How? I don't know how, Rossi admitted, but I know what I'm looking at. These aren't sculptures of people, Frank. These are the people. They now faced a procedural nightmare. They had a wild, incredible theory but no tangible proof. They couldn't get a warrant to seize and potentially damage a multimillion-dollar art collection based on a detective's hunch about a tattoo and a scar. They would be laughed out of the DA's office. They decided to approach the investigation from a different angle. They would focus on the artist herself, Serafina Monet. They dug into her background, and what they found was a carefully curated enigma. Like Evelyn Glass in the Oakhaven case, she seemed to have no past before her emergence on the art scene. She granted few interviews, and in those she did, she spoke in vague, philosophical terms about her art. She described her process as an act of preservation, a way of capturing the fleeting, fragile moments of human existence and making them eternal. Her words, once seen as profound artistic statements, now read like a murderer's manifesto. They discovered that she worked exclusively out of a massive, heavily secured private studio in the city's industrial district, a former warehouse that she had converted into a fortress. No one was allowed inside except for her and, occasionally, a trusted art handler. Their only hope was to talk to her, to look her in the eye and see if they could detect a crack in her perfect marble facade. They scheduled an interview with her at the gallery, under the pretext of discussing a potential security threat to her valuable collection. The next day, they met her. Serafina Monet was as elegant and formidable as her creations. She was a tall, ageless woman with sharp, intelligent features and eyes the color of slate. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace, and her voice was a low, melodic whisper that demanded attention. She listened to their feigned concerns about security with a polite, almost bored detachment. Her gaze was unervingly direct, and Rossi had the distinct feeling that Serafina could see right through their pretext. "My work is quite safe, I assure you," Serafina said, her lips curving into a faint, unreadable smile. "I take great care in preserving it." "Your realism is incredible," Rossi said, gesturing to the fallen sparrow. "It's as if you knew the subject intimately. The detail on his hand, the tattoo. It's perfect." Serafina's gaze followed hers. "The human form is a canvas of stories," she replied, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Every scar, every line, every imperfection tells a tale. My work is simply to listen to those tales and give them a voice in silence. To find a subject in a moment of pure, honest expression. That is the challenge. And once you find it, you must do whatever it takes to capture it before it fades away. You must make it permanent." Her words hung in the air, a veiled confession that was also a defiant challenge. She was telling them exactly what she did, daring them to prove it. As they left the gallery, Miller's skepticism had begun to erode, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The woman's eyes, her words, her chilling composure. Something was profoundly wrong. "Okay," he said, as they stood on the rain-slicked steps of the gallery. "We need to find out what that stone of hers really is, and we need to get inside that studio." They knew they were standing on the edge of a chasm of unimaginable horror. On one side was the sane, rational world of law and order. On the other was the silent, screaming world of Serafina Monet's gallery. And the only way to bridge that gap was to find a way to shatter one of her perfect, terrible creations and reveal the truth that lay within. The interview with Serafina Monet left Miller and Rossi in a state of profound unease. They had walked into the gallery with a monstrous theory and had walked out with the chilling conviction that it was true. Serafina's words were a carefully crafted confession, shielded by the ambiguity of artistic metaphor. She was playing with them, hiding in plain sight, confident in the belief that the sheer audacity of her crimes made her untouchable. Their investigation now split into two desperate parallel tracks. The first was to identify the proprietary material she used for her sculptures. The gallery's official catalog described it as a custom-blended, marble-infused polymer resin, a vague, technical-sounding description that meant nothing. Miller, relying on his old-school contacts, sent a photo of the material's crystalline structure, taken with a macro lens by Rossi's phone, to a friend in the state's forensic lab. The request was off the books, a favor from one grizzled veteran to another. The second track was to pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding Serafina herself. Rossi took the lead on this, diving headfirst into the digital rabbit hole of Serafina's non-existent past. She spent days, fueled by coffee and a growing obsession, searching for any trace of the woman before she had become a celebrated artist. She searched for financial records, educational transcripts, and property deeds, but it was as if Serafina Monet had been willed into existence 5 years ago, fully formed. The breakthrough came, as it often did, from a single, overlooked detail. In an early art blog review of one of her first, smaller shows, the blogger mentioned in passing that Serafina's work showed a profound understanding of organic chemistry, a sculptor's hand guided by a scientist's mind. It was a throwaway line of artsy praise, but to Rossi, it was a flare in the darkness. She refocused her search, shifting from art schools and residencies to scientific institutions and universities, searching for women who had excelled in the field of organic chemistry and material science, and who had dropped off the grid around the time Serafina had emerged. It was a painstaking process of cross-referencing names and timelines. After days of sifting through yearbooks and academic papers, she found a potential match, a brilliant but reclusive PhD student from a prestigious technical university named Dr. Elena Petrova. A chilling coincidence of last name that Rossi noted with a shudder. Dr. Elena Petrova had been a prodigy. Her doctoral thesis focused on the development of rapid curing, biocompatible polymers for use in advanced prosthetics and tissue preservation. Her work was groundbreaking but also controversial. Her peers described her as intensely private, obsessive, and possessing a detached, almost clinical view of the human body, seeing it less as a living organism and more as a complex machine of flesh and bone. Then, 6 years ago, she had abruptly abandoned her postdoctoral research, cleared out her lab, and vanished without a trace. Her photo, a grainy black and white image from her university ID, showed a young woman with the same sharp features and intense, slate-gray eyes as Serafina Monet. They had found her. Serafina, the artist, was a fiction. At her core, she was Dr. Elena Petrova, the brilliant chemist, a woman with the scientific knowledge to create the very stone she used to entomb her victims. At the same time, Miller got a call back from his friend at the crime lab. The initial analysis of the marble-infused resin was bizarre. "Frank, this stuff is unlike anything I've ever seen," his contact, a grizzled chemist named Mac, said over the phone. "It's a complex polymer, sure, but it's infused with an incredibly high concentration of calcium phosphate and other organic compounds. To be blunt, its elemental composition is remarkably similar to human bone, only vitrified, somehow. And there's something else. We detected trace amounts of a complex, non-proteinogenic amino acid, something usually associated with certain marine venoms. It's a powerful paralytic agent. Why the hell would a sculptor be mixing a paralytic into her sculpting material?" The pieces were slamming into place with a horrifying velocity. The science and the artist's method were beginning to merge. Dr. Elena Petrova, the chemist, had developed a process. A paralytic to subdue the victim, followed by a rapid infusion of her custom polymer. A substance that didn't just encase the body, but bonded with it on a cellular level, creating a perfect, terrifying form of preservation. She wasn't turning people into stone. She was turning them into a new, horrific substance, a fusion of flesh, bone, and chemical resin. Armed with this new knowledge, they knew they had to get inside her studio, but they still lacked the probable cause for a warrant. They had a strong suspicion, a scientific theory, and a potential former identity, but no direct evidence linking Serafina to the missing persons. Pushing for a warrant now would tip her off, and she would disappear again, taking her secrets and her victims with her. The case took another dark turn when a third person went missing. This time, it wasn't someone from the fringes of society. The victim was a well-known and widely disliked art critic named Julian Black, a man who had made a career out of his vitriolic and dismissive reviews. His last published piece had been a scathing critique of Serafina Monet's exhibition. He had called her work emotionally manipulative, technically brilliant but soulless, and a monument to gilded misery. He had vanished from his locked apartment, leaving behind a half-eaten meal and his beloved cat. The disappearance of a high-profile figure like Black elevated the case to a citywide panic. The pressure on Miller and Rossi was now crushing. They knew, with a sickening certainty, where Julian Black was. He was in Serafina's studio, in the process of being preserved, his final moments of terror and arrogance about to be immortalized as her next masterpiece. They needed a witness, someone who had been inside the fortress-like studio. They began a relentless search for anyone who had ever worked for Serafina. Contractors, delivery drivers, art handlers. Most had never been past the loading bay. But they finally found one name, a former studio assistant, a young art student named Ben Carter, who had quit after only 2 weeks on the job. They found Ben in a small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by half-finished paintings. He was a nervous, pale young man, and the moment they mentioned Serafina's name, a look of pure fear entered his eyes. "I can't talk about her," he stammered, wringing his hands. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement. She'll ruin me." "A man's life is at stake," Miller said, his voice a low, intimidating growl. "Your NDA is the least of your worries right now." Over the next hour, under Rossi's gentle but persistent questioning, Ben's story tumbled out. He had been hired to help with the menial tasks, mixing materials, cleaning the studio, preparing the sculpting armatures. He described Serafina as a demanding, obsessive employer. He spoke of the strange chemical smells, the humming of custom-built machinery, and the large walk-in kiln that was kept locked at all times. The event that had made him quit, however, was what he had seen one night. He had been working late when Serafina had left for a short time. Overcome by curiosity, he had peeked into her private sculpting area, a part of the studio that was strictly off-limits. There was a person, Ben whispered, his voice trembling. A woman, strapped to a large metal table. She wasn't moving. I thought she was a model, maybe she was asleep, but her eyes were open. She was just staring at the ceiling. There were tubes connected to her arms, leading to a machine. And all around the table, there were bags of the resin powder and vats of this clear, viscous liquid. He had seen Clara Bellwether, the second victim, in her final silent moments. "I saw Serafina coming back, and I ran," he continued, tears streaming down his face. "I quit the next day. I was too scared to go to the police. Who would believe me? She's Serafina Monet. And I was terrified she would come after me." Ben's terrified, tearful testimony was the key. It was the direct eyewitness account they needed. They now had more than enough probable cause. As they rushed to get the warrant signed by an emergency judge, Rossi felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. They had a witness. They had the science. They were about to raid the alchemist's workshop. But Julian Black, the art critic, had been missing for over 48 hours. They were no longer on a mission to uncover a series of murders. They were in a desperate race against time, a rescue mission that they knew, deep down, was almost certainly doomed to fail. They were not going to find Julian Black alive. They were going to find him as the newest, most grotesque addition to Serafina's gallery of echoes. The raid on Serafina Monet's studio was executed at dusk. The sky over Argento's industrial district was bruised with shades of purple and orange as a fleet of unmarked police cars and a tactical van descended on the cavernous, windowless warehouse. The air was thick with a tense, grim silence. Miller and Rossi, clad in tactical vests, stood at the forefront, the signed warrant a heavy, righteous weight in Miller's hand. This was the culmination of weeks of impossible theories and horrifying discoveries. This was the moment of truth. The tactical team breached the massive steel door with a hydraulic ram. The sound echoed through the cavernous space like a thunderclap, a violent intrusion into a place that had been sealed off from the world. They poured into the main studio space, a vast, hangar-like room that was surprisingly clean and organized. On one side were massive bags of chemical compounds, neatly stacked on pallets. On another were the tools of a sculptor, chisels, grinders, and polishing machines of every conceivable size. In the center of the room stood a collection of metal armatures, skeletal frameworks waiting for their grim purpose. But there were no statues, and there was no sign of Serafina or Julian Black. "Clear!" came the shout from the tactical leader. The main space was empty. Rossi's eyes were drawn to a heavy, soundproof door at the far end of the room, the door Ben Carter had described as leading to Serafina's private workshop. This was the heart of the operation. With weapons raised, the team breached the second door. The room beyond was a surreal and horrifying fusion of an artist's studio and a mad scientist's laboratory. A large, stainless steel table, disturbingly similar to a mortician's slab, stood in the center of the room, fitted with restraints. Next to it was a complex apparatus of pumps, tubes, and monitors. Vats of the clear, viscous liquid Ben had described were lined against one wall. And against the other wall, humming quietly, was the massive, walk-in industrial kiln. The room was empty of people. But on a small work table, Rossi found a series of sketches. They were anatomical studies of a man's face, captured in a rictus of arrogant indignation. It was Julian Black. And next to the sketches was a clay bust of his head, a work in progress, his expression of contempt perfectly rendered. Serafina was in the middle of her process. "Where is she?" Miller growled, his hand resting on his sidearm. "And where's the victim?" It was Rossi who noticed the seam in the floor, a faint outline of a large square section of the concrete that was slightly different in color. It was a freight elevator, a hidden one not on the building's original schematics. The control panel was cleverly concealed behind a rack of tools. The tactical team pried the doors open, revealing a dark, descending shaft. This was it, the place where she kept her finished work, her private gallery. Miller, Rossi, and a small team of officers stepped into the elevator, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The descent was slow and silent, a journey into the earth, into Serafina's personal underworld. When the elevator shuddered to a halt, the doors opened onto a scene of absolute, breathtaking horror. They were in a long, climate-controlled hall, painted a stark, gallery white, and lined up on either side, each on a simple black plinth and illuminated by a single, perfectly aimed spotlight, were the statues. Not just the two from the gallery, but dozens more. A silent, frozen crowd of the lost and the forgotten. There was a terrified-looking teenage runaway, a defiant-faced homeless man, a woman in a business suit whose face was a mask of shock and betrayal. It was a timeline of her monstrosity, a collection of souls she had harvested from this city and others. Each one was a perfect, terrible monument to their final, agonizing moments on Earth. And at the far end of the hall, on a central, elevated plinth, was her newest, unfinished creation. It was the figure of a man, seated in a chair, his body contorted in a silent scream. The stone was still slightly translucent, the process not yet complete. Through the milky, semi-hardened resin, they could see the faint, horrifying outline of the human form within. It was Julian Black, and standing before him, admiring her work with a polisher in her hand, was Serafina Monet. She turned as the detective's lights fell upon her. She was wearing a simple black jumpsuit, her face calm, her slate-gray eyes showing not a flicker of fear or surprise. She looked at them as if they were merely rude patrons who had ignored the closed sign on the gallery door. "The critics," she said, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that was a grotesque counterpoint to the horror surrounding them. "They are never satisfied. I was just finishing his review." "It's over, Elena," Rossi said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She used Serafina's real name, a deliberate attempt to shatter the artistic persona. A flicker of annoyance crossed the sculptor's face. "The artist's name is Serafina," she corrected, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Elena Petrova was a scientist. She was merely the caterpillar. "I am the butterfly." "You are a killer," Miller snarled, his gun trained on her. "You are under arrest for the murders of every single person in this room." Serafina let out a soft, pitying laugh. "Murder? "Inspector, you lack vision. This is not a morgue. This is a sanctuary. I found these people in moments of decay, of fleeting, meaningless pain. I gave them purpose. I gave them immortality. I took their ugly, transient suffering and I made it into something eternal, something beautiful. They will be admired for centuries, long after your own insignificant life has turned to dust. I did not kill them. I saved them from the disease of time." Her confession was a chilling, self-aggrandizing manifesto. She was not a monster in her own mind. She was a savior, an artist with a purpose so profound that ordinary morality could not apply to it. As the tactical officers moved in to apprehend her, Serafina showed her final, desperate act of defiance. She pressed a button on a small remote she held in her hand. With a hiss of hydraulics, heavy steel doors slammed down, sealing the exits to the gallery. And then, a low hissing sound filled the air as vents in the ceiling began to release a colorless, odorless gas. "The paralytic agent I use is quite fast-acting when aerosolized," Serafina said, her voice calm as she backed away towards a small, sealed alcove at the end of the gallery. "You will not die. You will simply stop. And I will have all the time in the world to decide which of your final expressions is most worthy of preservation. A new collection. The interlopers, perhaps." Panic began to set in as the officers felt the first tingling sensations in their limbs. But Rossi, remembering the university papers she had read, knew there had to be a flaw. Elena Petrova was a chemist. Every reaction has a counter-reaction. "The gas needs a catalyst to bond to the neural receptors," she shouted, her mind racing. "It's the humidity in the air, the fire suppression system." Miller, understanding immediately, drew his weapon and fired 2 rounds into a sprinkler head on the ceiling. With a shower of water, the fire suppression system roared to life, drenching the gallery in a cold, chemical-laced downpour. The water reacted with the gas, neutralizing it, causing it to fall to the floor as a harmless, inert powder. Serafina watched from her alcove, her expression of calm superiority finally shattering into a mask of pure, reptilian fury. Her masterpiece, her final act of creation, had been ruined. The butterfly's wings had been broken. With her last resort foiled, she surrendered without a further struggle. She was led away in silence, past the frozen audience of her victims, her expression once again a mask of cold, unreadable detachment. The trial of Dr. Elena Petrova, the sculptor of souls, was a global sensation. The world was horrified and captivated by the story of the brilliant scientist who had become a monstrous artist. She never spoke a word in her own defense, instead sitting in the courtroom with the air of a misunderstood genius, observing the proceedings with a clinical, detached curiosity. She was found guilty and sentenced to spend the rest of her life in a supermax prison, her only view of the world a small, reinforced window. The statues, her morbid masterpieces, were carefully removed from the underground gallery. They were no longer art. They were human remains, the evidence of an unthinkable series of crimes. For a long time, the city of Argento did not know what to do with them. They were a gallery of ghosts, a silent, screaming testament to the darkness that could hide behind a mask of beauty. Months later, Miller and Rossi stood on a bluff overlooking the city. The case had changed them both, leaving scars that would never fully heal. "Do you think she ever sees them as people?" Rossi asked quietly. "Or were they always just material to her?" Miller stared at the stone buildings of the city, at the statues in the distant parks. "I think," he said, his voice low and weary, "that she was the one who was truly made of stone. We just finally put her on a shelf where she belongs." They had stopped a monster and brought her to justice. But they knew that in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, they would forever be haunted by the images from that dark gallery, by the silent, pleading eyes of the people who had been turned into art by a woman who had forgotten how to be human. The unveiling was over, but the echoes of the silent screams would last forever.